Thanks. You are the hardcore. You have stayed until the bitter end, and I'm extremely pleased now to welcome as our closing speaker Luukas Ilves, who is currently the Councillor for Digital Affairs at the Estonian Permanent Representation here in Brussels, and he's previously worked as a cybersecurity expert and for the former Commissioner Nelly Kroes. And he's here to share with us his experiences of the Estonian experience of digital transformation. Luukas, thank you very much for joining us, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was just commenting to Stephen that, interestingly enough, I may be the youngest speaker, but I'm also the only one who's a lifetime civil servant. So entre nous, communist to communist, as we like to say in Estonia. But so I feel that there's been a lot of, I guess this is nice, I see the slides here. There's been a lot of talk about e-Estonia, especially in the last 2 months with Commissioner Ansip, although as I've been reminded, he is not in fact the first Estonian digital commissioner. Those of you who are in Digit will know that Siim Kallas was your commissioner 2004 to 2009, so we've already had 2 Estonian digital commissioners. I like this trend. But actually, I want to sort of project some modesty about maybe some of the hype that you hear about e-Estonia. There are some things that we've done well, and I'm going to talk about those today, but we're no miracle country. I mean, you can look at the Digital Agenda scoreboard, and you'll see plenty of indicators where we don't do very well. Some in which we're, in fact, dead last in Europe. So, for instance, the percentage of physical goods ordered online, or the portion of the population using e-commerce to order goods online, is something like 20% in Estonia. And there are all sorts of reasons, and I would say if we had a well-functioning digital single market, we wouldn't have that problem. But the fact of the matter is, no country in Europe has a monopoly on good solutions, and I have the luxury of talking today about some of the things we do well, but we're equally dependent on a lot of on the EU and a lot of our neighbors and the things we don't do so well. And what we're good at in general is sort of, we're a very small country, we're a fairly young country, is doing and building stuff. So we're not very good market regulators. We don't, have 100 copyright lawyers or 100 trade lawyers who can go and sort of figure out exactly what the EU's negotiating position should be at TTIP. But we have been building stuff that is fairly disruptive since the 90s. And in fact, the very first thing we started building that I would sort of view as the beginning of all this was we had to build a new country in the 90s. And so that got us going on how to use technology as a way to accomplish a lot of our tasks. And here we go. One of these. I'm just kidding. Voila. So, I don't actually like the word e-government, and I don't like the word public sector modernization. And the problem is that these are what we have in our vocabulary, but if we actually look at what we're talking about, we're not just talking about government, we're not talking about the public sector. I mean, if you look at e-procurement as a good example, this has been something that's been driven as a project by the public sector, but now we see private companies sending e-invoices to private companies using a PEPL standard. Is that e-government? I'm not so sure. Or EID, similarly, much of the use cases and the value actually comes from the private sector. So my first request to you before I talk about Estonia is if anyone has sort of an alternative term to e-government or public sector modernization or public sector ICT, I'd love to hear it because we need it. And we need it so that we can convince all the people who care about growth and jobs in Europe that this is actually a very useful enabler. Because otherwise they view a lot of what we're talking about here, a lot of the sort of background on the e-services, a lot of the infrastructure is sort of boring technology that doesn't really lead to social and economic change. And what I want to tell you is that that's very much not the case. Because if there's one thing that you can learn from Estonia, it's that getting some of the infrastructural questions right actually can then drive a lot of the sort of larger economic changes. And I want to talk about 2 infrastructural components that make up what we usually talk about when we talk about e-Estonia. And the first of those is electronic identity. Or I guess I put PKI here, and you could sort of put smart cards, and those are tokens, those are useful. But really it's about having a well-functioning electronic identity system that is fairly strong from a cryptographic standpoint, that then lets you build services on top of that. And how we got to sort of having a whole-of-government EID system. In the late 90s, we realized that we needed some kind of electronic identity. And it was actually the banks who started realizing that their existing PIN and username logins weren't secure enough. They needed to move to a more secure system. But they realized they didn't actually have the money, because Estonia is a small country and you don't have economies of scale, to roll out a full, proper PKI system for all their customers, bank by bank. So they got together and they said, well, we could all do it together. In fact, why don't we go to the government and get them to sort of write some enabling legislation that will support our system? And the outcome was that we actually had the banks and the telcos put together one PPP, or one sort of joint venture that, along with the government, basically rolled out a nationwide electronic ID scheme. We gave everyone my wallet is in my coat, so I can't show you my EID. Also, please don't go steal my wallet. But so we basically rolled out an electronic an ID card in the early 2000s. It had a chip on it, which is fairly similar to the ID cards that many countries in Europe now have. So if you're a Belgian, you take out your Belgian ID card. It's the same infrastructure. But where Estonia was different, certainly in the mid 2000s, and I think where we're still we lead the pack, is in the actual usage of this ID. And the key driver there was that public sector use cases aren't actually that useful for the average citizen. How often do you interact with the government? And I'm not counting the European Commission, but really sort of the government where you live. You pay your taxes once a year. You have to ask for a permit from time to time. But actually, you want to interact with them as little as possible. Now think about how much you interact with the bank, paying your bills, being an e-commerce customer. So what we got right was realizing that if we had the same infrastructure that was being used by both the government and the private sector, we could actually drive the adoption. And the success has been pretty remarkable. Today, we have had, I can give you the exact number as of today at 3 p.m., since rolling out our EID, 185,441,945 digital signatures have been given off of 1.3 million Estonians, including children and very old people. And what's amazing there is that we're still seeing exponential growth. So this year we will have about 60 million digital signatures. Last year we had about 50 million, the year before 40. So you'd think you'd reach a saturation point where you sort of level off and people have given as many digital signatures per year as they can. But we're still not seeing that. So if I look at where the use rates are elsewhere in Europe, there's a huge way to go there. And the value for people's lives is actually pretty immense. What we've calculated is that you save about, as an average citizen, a week of time a year from forms you haven't filled out, paperwork you haven't carried in, optimized workflows. That's 2% of your time, 2% of GDP. Obviously, the distribution's uneven. If you're just a consumer, it'll be less. But if you're a small business person that has a lot of contracts, permitting, etc., that can make a huge difference. So first of all, the first component that has enabled a lot of our interesting services and that created the trust and the technological foundation for a lot of those services was having an EID that was two-factor. So you have the chip and you have the PIN. And this is very important. The security shouldn't be underestimated, because having a strong EID actually means that you can put more faith in the identity of the person you're talking to, and that means you can build more services on top of that. So would you have an e-health system where you let people look at their medical records if you could easily steal their identity? No. If you have some confidence in the credentials they have, then you'll let them do that. Would you let them vote if that identity could easily be stolen? No. If you have the security, you will. So we remain somewhat security evangelists when we talk about that. The second thing was an interoperability architecture that we built for the public sector. And we started really from the problem of not having money. So in the late 90s, we needed to build, we realized we needed to get various sort of silos to start speaking with each other. We needed to connect various information systems. And when we tabulated the cost in, I think, 99 for a sort of whole of government project to build bilaterally all the different links and services we needed, it was 30 times the budget we had, which wasn't very large. So we realized we needed one enterprise architecture for the whole government. And we sort of procured and came up with something, or an Estonian company came up with something that we call X-Road. We would tell you it's the best architecture out there, it's better than what Oracle and IBM provide, but I don't want to argue about that. In fact, if you look at other countries that have rolled out whole of government enterprise architectures, they look like this. They're basically functionally analogous. But what's much, much cooler is a different picture that is sort of a different way of looking at it, which is this. And this is a mapping of a small subset of data objects and information systems. I was looking at this, if I remember correctly, in the bottom right corner, it's various objects related to land property. Then if you move to the left, it's some internal affairs and, business registry related, and then at the top it's some internal affairs related. And this picture is a few years old. But the point is you can actually do a mapping of your interoperability schema, the services you provide, and this is just the theoretical, the theoretical schema, not with the data flow volumes. But this is a different kind of organogram of how government works. And you can do a whole bunch of these. And the result of all of this is that, well, first of all, it's analytically really interesting because you get a picture of how your government works. But you also open things up and you decentralize things. So the advantage of having, if I go back to this, a standardized architecture that it was fairly easy to build new services on top of, and we disaggregated the security and the interoperability from the functional control, from the substantive control of who gives permission to access what data, is it became trivial to write a new service. If I was in the, let's pick a good example. If I was working for a health, for the sort of national health insurer, and I realized that I could optimize sort of patient billing by combining some data from the population registry, the tax registry, and removing sort of a mechanical or a sort of a process step, it takes me technically it's a few hours of scripting to do that. And I have to go speak to the controllers of the data and get their permission. But the result of this is that we saw in the mid-2000s an explosion of the number of services and an explosion in the interconnection of data, because basically you would go look at the data schemas, you would come up with a service, you would get a quick approval, and that was it. So when Commissioner Oettinger said that, innovation, that's something for the private sector to do with your open data, I would hopefully join Mike Bracken in saying that that's not the case. I mean, a lot of innovation can actually come from the civil servants who are responsible for providing the services. And we think that providing this type of an architecture makes it a lot easier because you can cut a lot of the bureaucracy out. My favorite case was a colleague who had just had a child and realized how cumbersome all the forms were. And so he went to basically the 7 different agencies that he at that point had to submit PDF forms to get, or his wife had to submit the PDF forms to get the maternity benefit. And he said, we can automate this. And at first he said, no. He kept on bothering them for 2 weeks. Finally he said yes, and a week later the automated service was set up. So, and by the way, we do give away our interoperability architecture for free to other EU member states. So if anyone's interested, or if any, we're doing a great project now with Finland, where basically we are jointly developing the next version of the interoperability architecture, and then we'll deploy it in both countries. But what I want to get to is that we've done some interesting stuff. It's enabled us to provide a lot of cool services. We think that we made the right architectural choices, but at this point most European countries have made similar choices or are in the process of making it. Just about everyone has some kind of a national EID scheme, or they will soon. We think the pressure will lead them to a higher security level. There's some kind of national interoperability. What comes next? I'm going to tell you about a few cool projects that we're doing in Estonia, the value of which is that the technology is being used to drive a larger project. The first is something we call data embassies. And the realization we had is that actually, given the extent to which a lot of what our government does is now electronic and really is based purely on the registries and the e-services, we don't actually need to have physical control of our territory to have a functioning government that provides all the services that most citizens expect. So if you take the worst case scenario of Russia doing something like what it's done in Crimea, not something we think will happen, but I used to work for the defense ministry who planned for the worst case, we would today be able to provide most public services, allow the people to vote, promulgate laws, etc., even if part of our territory were taken. So that got us thinking, what about having some kind of a backup version across the world? And so we now have this sort of long-term ambition of having the entire virtual infrastructure of our government be virtualized and be able to run from anywhere in the world. There will be hopefully an interesting announcement with regards to some of the initial piloting next month. The next project is something we call virtual residence. And so the idea is that given that we have this EID platform, Right now we give an electronic identity to Estonian citizens and permanent residents, but there might be others who first of all would want to interact in an Estonian ecosystem and then would love to have a secure credential that, thanks to ADAS, might work elsewhere in the EU. So we're going to start giving out not residence permits, but just really these electronic credentials to people who come initially to Estonia, then to an Estonian embassy, and it will be the sort of technically the same certificates that we give to Estonian citizens, permanent residents, and that the real use case for me, I'll give a personal example, is I have a small nonprofit that I was on the board of, and we had some board members from the US. So anytime we wanted to change something like the charter, we had to get their signature, notarized, etc. If we can give them an e-residency, then they can also sign it with the Estonian signature, and we're done. And the last sort of interesting goal that we've now set is to get rid of legacy in the public sector. We were lucky in the 90s that we didn't have any IT legacy, and that's kept our costs down. Our IT spend in total for the entire public sector is 50 million euros a year, which is particularly interesting when you think that IT doesn't scale linearly. So you'd think it'd be more expensive for us per person than it would be in the UK. But that's because we don't have legacy costs. We're losing that advantage quickly. So now we have this goal that any system that is more than 13 years old gets redesigned from the ground up. I want to say it's a new goal. We don't know how it's going to work in practice. And then finally, how am I doing on time? Am I over yet? All right. So a couple of EU-level goals. The first, something that we've been preaching to your colleagues in Digit and Connect about is e-interaction. And it's the idea that if we have all of these national interoperability solutions that can sort of exchange data between all sorts of databases in a live, we also need to be able to get the different national platforms or regional platforms to be able to interact with each other on a live basis and set up complex services between those. A second goal is a more high-level political one, which we see as a driver for a lot of the interoperability work. And it's the idea that as a citizen, you should have the right to request that the public sector in Europe only request your data once. So if I've given my medical records to someone in Estonia, and then in Spain, I've moved to Spain, and a specialist wants it there, I should actually have the right to demand that he gets that information from Estonia instead of asking it from me. Or if I'm a business owner and I'm setting up activities in Belgium, then if the Belgian public administration wants me to certify that I have some kind of paperwork done, I just authorize them to go request that from the Estonians. And this feeds into this sort of larger right to good administration. And why it's relevant is it shows some of the actual outcome values from what is technical interoperability, kind of boring work, if you're not in it. And I want to make that important caveat. And the last one, we wrote into our national e-government strategy an EU-level goal, which I think is maybe ambitious for a tiny little country in Europe, that 20% of Europeans should use electronic signatures by 2020. So we've now committed ourselves to helping the other 99.7% of Europe catch up with us. But so that we're not only talking about positive things, I also want to talk about a very practical difficulty or dilemma that I've faced and that my colleagues have faced over the last couple of years, which is that when we're talking about a lot of the interesting things that we can do bilaterally with our partners, this is a generalization, but there are two ways to go. One is that you just talk to them directly. You do what we're doing with Finland, which is we have a cool idea, let's the two of us get together, work it out. It's quick. If it's two small countries talking to each other, you can do it overnight, and you get quick results. The other option is to go through the sort of infrastructure of projects, of programs, of funding that the EU has. It moves slowly. It can be frustrating at times. Now, I've been trying to make the argument in Estonia, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, that at this point, the ship is leaving the harbor. If we look at the momentum behind CEF, we look at the momentum behind what will be the new ICT program, behind what both Digit and Connect are doing with a lot of other services, at this point, we don't have a choice. We have to be on board with the EU programs. That isn't always an argument I can win. And I don't want to get into the details, but what I would encourage you all to think about is how the EU can, or how the Commission, rather, because we're all the EU, how the Commission can find ways to not just itself be more agile, and I think there's a very strong, sort of very strong role that you can play in setting an example, because let's take a random example. If we have the e-delivery component from the CEF, if every single commission service that is somehow e-service that is somehow accessible by EU citizens or public administrations uses the same e-delivery component, that's going to be a really strong argument, or uses the same authentication component, that's going to be a really strong argument, but also thinks about ways to make the project financing a little bit more agile. I'll give you an example. We got about 50,000 euros last year from the Baltic Sea region to do a pre-feasibility study to see if tax administrations could exchange data. And that basically paid for, a part-time project manager and a couple of meetings, and we got the Estonian, Latvian, Swedish, and Finnish tax authorities together, and 3 meetings later, they had a great project plan. I don't know where it's going to go, because that's where they got today, but they needed for that 50,000 euros. Probably they could have done it with less if you'd really squeezed them. Not an expensive project, not a large-scale pilot, not millions, but when you're talking about national civil servants whose #1 priority is always to focus on the services they're providing to their citizens, they often need small, flexible funds to get to that point. And if they'd had to apply, if they'd gone through the funding cycle that you don't have for these regional funds, but you have for the sort of EU-wide funds, the 6-month process of applying, etc., would have discouraged them. Now, I'm not, I realize in the context of all this, the member states are at fault for a lot of these rules. So I don't want to accuse anyone here, but I want to say there's a lot of work that we all need to do collectively, because the vision that we now have that's been set by the Commission for how we're going to get from where we are today to this really quite interoperable European-wide structure of services, both public and private, is impressive. But as we've heard several times today, the real key is not in the strategy, it's in the delivery. So with all of that, I want to finish up by saying that in addition to our general Estonian commitment to making e-government work in Estonia and across borders, we also have the additional commitment of holding the Council presidency in 2018. So you'll be seeing and hearing more from us, and I look forward to working with all of you. Thank you.